Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Clark Merrifield. I'm the senior editor for economics and legal systems at the Journalist Resource. My co-host is Michael Klein, William L. Klein Professor of International Economics Affairs at Tufts University, and also founder and executive editor of EconoFact. If you don't subscribe to the EconoFact or JR newsletters, I hope that you will after today, and I'll put those links in the chat soon. Today we have Andy Zimbalist, Robert A. Woods Professor Emeritus of Economics at Smith College. Andy, great to have you. Victor Matheson, a sports economist at the College of the Holy Cross. Victor, great to have you here as well. And last but not least, Alan Snell, publisher of lvsportsbiz.com, which covers the convergence of sports, business, stadiums, and politics. Alan is joining us bright and early from Las Vegas. Thank you for that, Alan. And Alan is perhaps the only journalist in the country, I could be wrong about that, but he might be the only one covering this whole topic full time. So we're really grateful to have him here as well. One last thing before we jump in. We want to hear from you. We want your questions. We want to get to those later on. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box. If it goes in the chat box, we're not going to ask it. And if you can, please add your name, the organization that you work for, and the type of media that you do, TV, print, online, whatever the case may be. And without further ado, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick things off.
Thank you, Clark, and thank you to Andy, Victor, and Alan for joining us this morning. So I'm calling in from Boston, which is, as you know, the hub of the universe and a sports town. And there is a controversy now in Boston about the financing of a soccer stadium. And there was a few years ago controversy about hosting the Olympics. So we're not unfamiliar with the issue of the public financing of sports. We're also not at all unfamiliar with how popular sports are. So there's a tension here. And of course, it's a multidimensional problem, but the economics of it is very important. So I'd like to ask our panelists first, how are sports venues, stadiums and such, typically financed, and what's the public role in that? And I'll ask them each to answer.
In any particular order, Michael?
Since you started off, Andy, you can go. We'll go in reverse alphabetical order by last name or alphabetical order by first name. So you win either way.
So the financing plan over the years has shifted a great deal. Back when stadiums were, the cookie cutter stadiums were created in the 60s and 70s, very close to 100% of financing came from public sources. As stadiums became more and more expensive, back then they would cost $150, $250 million. Today they cost $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, up to $5 billion SoFi in Inglewood, Los Angeles, California. So as the price tag has gone higher and higher, and as evidence has become more available about the absence of a positive economic impact, it's become more and more politically problematic to put down large sums of public money. And so at least on the surface, what's happened is the share of public financing has gone down. If you look at the entire period between 1970 and 2020, you have somewhere on the order of 72, 73% of outward financing coming from public sources. If you look at the last decade, or you look at 2010 to 2020, that number drops to close to 40%. So there's been a great deal of shifting. But one of the things that's important to point out here is that the extant numbers that are available publicly don't tell the whole story. There's also very, very substantial concessions around land and development rights. There are tax abatements and tax exemptions and several other factors which make it very difficult to identify exact numbers.
I think that last point is really important for the journalists on the call because they're presented with certain numbers, but the economic idea of opportunity cost, something we'll return to, is really important. Victor?
So I think an important thing to add to what Andy says is there's a gigantic range in these sort of financing numbers, right? So we have a stadium in Buffalo, $850 million of public financing there for about a $1.3 billion stadium. We have Tennessee, where we've got about $1.3 billion of public financing on the NFL stadium there of about a $2 billion price tag. But that doesn't have to be the case. I was just talking to a reporter just the other day on NPR of all things, and they were saying, well, well, we know that you have to have some element of public financing for these stadiums, and that's the way the conversation started, and that's not true at all. We have the Golden State Warriors playing in an entirely privately financed stadium in San Francisco. We have SoFi Stadium that Andy talked about in LA, almost entirely privately financed there, and that's about a $5 billion stadium. So I think one of the most important things to take from this hour is the public financing is not required. Stadiums can be built all over the place with private money, and most of the stadiums that are in the process of being replaced, they don't need to be replaced. The owners want them to be replaced. These are perfectly functional stadiums that make large profits currently for the owners. It's just that the owners want to make more profit, especially if they can get someone else to pay for their stadium.
Alan, do you want to talk specifically about your region in Las Vegas?
Yeah, yes, sir. You're talking about two stadiums here in Las Vegas. 2016, the Raiders Stadium was approved in a bill. And this is something I think is important in reporting the topic. What you'll see is that the bill, you'll see stories saying that the bill designated $750 million in public money to build a Raiders Stadium that cost $1.4 billion to construct. The missing link in this is that people don't understand, and they're not even told a lot by journalists, that our region is actually raising more than $1 billion in revenue over the 30-year debt repayment period. So yeah, it's $750 million, but the true impact is raising more than $1 billion over the 30-year debt repayment period. As Andy mentioned, sometimes the percentage of public money is perhaps going down. We saw this with our athletic stadium that is kind of newsworthy right now. In fact, later today, there's a stadium board meeting here in Las Vegas that I'll be getting to. And in that case, $380 million of public money of government assistance was designated in a bill that was approved last year. It includes some tax credits, and it also, this is kind of a quirky thing, it includes $120 million in Clark County bonds. And technically speaking, even though the bill was approved, Clark County, where the stadium is going to be located, the Strip here in Vegas is in Clark County, has not technically approved the $120 million bonds. And also something to keep in mind, there's always an X factor of how much money the local government will contribute in terms of infrastructure costs. In this particular A stadium project, there's $25 million in county money that's supposed to be paid. But, keep in mind, the county commissioners still have to technically approve the $120 million in bonds. Again, how much money does Southern Nevada have to raise to pay off the $120 million bonds? That number has not been identified yet.
Alan, I just want to jump in here and sorry, I just want to make sure that people on the call understand exactly what you're talking about. So this is a funding mechanism for the public money. This is a bond. And so what you're talking about is the interest on that debt.
Kind of like paying back a mortgage on your house.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
And well, let me just jump in here as well. And again, Las Vegas paints a perfect example of you don't need to subsidize sports stadiums. By far the most successful professional sports franchise in Las Vegas history is the Golden Knights, right? The NHL team that's won a Stanley Cup. And in just its first few years of existence, this is a team that built its own arena, no public money.
Victor, just in that particular case, you had MGM Resorts and AEG combining, along eventually the owner of the Golden Knights did buy 15% share. But
Right.
you're right.
So here's
privately built.
Privately
built.
private financing for a stadium. While the next pro team that comes in gets $750 million of taxpayer subsidy, and of course, as Alan says, once you run those out through the future, the total payments will be over $1 billion. But this is a huge amount of taxpayer money for one sports franchise, when Las Vegas has shown in history that it can attract sports franchises without a dime of public money.
So I'd like to follow up with something that Andy first introduced, the idea of opportunity cost. This is a central idea in economics, that if you do one thing, you necessarily aren't doing something else. And it's not always pecuniary or obvious what the opportunity costs are. And those have to be taken into account. So I'd like to ask each of you, what are some opportunity costs that might be hidden or not obvious that should be considered when thinking about the financing of stadiums or sports venues? Andy, you want to start off?
And I feel that, yeah, and let me just go back a little bit historically. There was a major shift in stadium design and arena design that happened back in 1992. Larry Lucchino, then the president of the Baltimore Orioles, decided that to replace the existing stadium, Memorial Stadium, that was up north of downtown Baltimore, a couple of miles near Johns Hopkins University, on side streets, Lucchino decided that he was going to change the pattern that existed in the 70s, the 60s and 70s. That was a pattern for stadiums to go out to the suburbs. As the country in the 50s and 60s automobilized and suburbanized itself, the stadiums followed them to the suburbs. What Lucchino did was reasoned, if I can put a stadium downtown Baltimore next to the business district, I'll be able to attract business people at the end of the workday into the stadium to watch the games, to have some drinks, if we put a nice restaurant or two there as well in the stadium, we'll get a higher income clientele into the stadium. And by getting the higher income clientele into the stadium, you also increase the value of advertising and signage at the stadium. And Lucchino and his new park, Camden Yards, was a gold mine for the Baltimore Orioles back then. Very soon, other teams wanted to emulate his example. And so we've gone through a period now of roughly 30 years of constructions, stadiums and arenas moving from the suburbs to the downtown area. This has to do with the opportunity cost, believe it or not. As more and more stadiums or sports facilities in general are located in the downtown area rather than out in the suburbs, the land becomes more and more precious. There's less available land. There's more activity in the center cities. And so the price goes higher and higher and higher. So one of the things that goes on here is that you're taking more valuable land. You were out in the suburbs where there's a lot of land, and now you're in the cities where there's not very much land. It's more valuable. So if you decide to take 10 acres for, say, an arena or a stadium, or if it's a football stadium and it needs tailgating, then maybe it could be 30 acres. You're taking very valuable land that obviously has other potential uses. Sometimes those uses are not immediately obvious to a city, or maybe they don't even have them immediately, but maybe 5 years or 10 years down the road, they do. And when you build a stadium or an arena, you're talking about, generally speaking, at least a 30-year commitment of very valuable and scarce urban real estate.
And let me just follow on with Andy on that, because this 30-year number is actually extremely important for every reporter here on this call, because no matter whether you are a reporter who is currently in a city that has a stadium deal, if you're a Jacksonville reporter, if you're you're a Virginia reporter with the Wizards and the Capitals, this is going to affect all of you, even if you don't currently have a stadium deal. Because as Andy said, we had this huge wave of stadium construction started in 1992, started by this highly successful stadium in Baltimore. Most of those stadiums are associated with a 30-year lease deal. And because of that, these teams are tied to the stadiums for 30 years, which means that they really can't start asking for a new stadium or asking for new public subsidies until those lease deals expire. But as soon as those lease deals expire, all of the bargaining power shifts to the teams and away from the taxpayer. And because we have all of these lease deals expiring over the next say, decade or so because of this wave of stadium construction that happened 30 years ago. No matter what city you're in, almost certainly you're going to be writing stadium stories in the next 10 or 15 years because almost every city in the United States has a stadium with a lease deal expiring, a 30-year lease deal expiring in the next decade or so. So be prepared, and we're super happy you're on the call.
Michael, in terms of hidden costs, I'm covering the athletic stadium deal here in Las Vegas. You're talking about a $1.5 billion dome stadium that is being built in a kind of a unique and very controversial location. It's being built literally in the heart of the Strip, and that means infrastructure. Clark County is on the hook for $25 million, but I got news for you. The infrastructure to service a stadium on the Strip at Tropicana Avenue in Las Vegas Boulevard is going to be running, obviously into the tens of millions for the lifetime of the 30-year deal. So you're talking about costs that we don't even know to service a stadium that is in the heart. Right now, people are kind of wondering, how are we going to get to the stadium when traffic is already very brutal right on the Strip?
Let's talk about one more hidden one as well, because I hear this from reporters all the time, is that stadiums are very often financed with a mix of taxes. One of the very most common taxes is a hotel tax, right? So you redirect hotel taxes from people who come in and visit a city towards the stadium. And you say, well, look, we don't have to worry about this because this isn't local taxpayers paying the taxes. These are people from outside of town. So in fact, this stadium isn't going to cost taxpayers anything because it's all going to be paid for from people outside the region. There's two problems with this. One is what's known as the tax incidence cost. And that's when you put a tax on something, it's not always the person who buys the product who pays the tax. It can also be the person who sells the product, right? As you have higher and higher taxes on hotels, that makes your hotels harder and harder to compete for convention business or for tourism business, and so they might have to reduce their room prices for a portion of that taxes. So that's what's called tax incidence. But opportunity costs is, of course, what Michael was talking about. Is it is true that you can take hotel taxes and direct them towards a stadium, but tourism is going to occur whether you have a stadium or not, which means that you are going to have tourism and hotel taxes being generated. And guess what? Those hotel taxes don't have to be directed towards a stadium. They can be directed to police officers and firefighters and school teachers like we're seeing in Las Vegas. Or if you're not a tax and spend sort of person, you're a fiscal conservative, they can be directed towards reducing taxes elsewhere in the local economy. So anytime we take a hotel tax and direct it towards a stadium, it means that hotel tax revenue is not available for any other purpose in the city that's building that stadium.
Let me just very quickly expand what Victor said. Hotel taxes is one form of tax that is generally referred to as a tourist tax. The other form is car rental taxes. So it's exactly the same analysis that Victor gave for hotel taxes also applies to car rental.
So a very important economic concept in public finance is whether or not taxes are regressive or progressive. That is, whether they hit the poor more or the rich more. There, was a discussion a few years ago when there was, I think it was a baseball strike. It was the millionaires versus the billionaires. And also, as Andy mentioned, stadiums are now going towards pricing for higher income clientele. So I know that, the price of tickets for watching the Celtics or the Red Sox is very high. So it's not like, people can afford to go to the bleachers for $10 for a game or something like that. And so it seems like a lot of the benefits are going to very rich people. And as Victor mentioned, the opportunity cost is that we're not having infrastructure for schools or sewer systems or roads or things like that. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists a little bit about the equity issues involved here, something you really don't hear much about.
Michael, can I just jump in here on reporting the topic? we talk about the funding, financing of the stadiums. What I find a lot of reporters sometimes miss is that under these deals, the owners of the teams are winning. They're garnering by far the lion's share of stand that you'll see these big, gigantic economic impact numbers. Well, that's fine, but the bottom line is it's the pro teams that are garnering the benefits of the revenues from the stadiums. And in the case of the Raiders here in Las Vegas, because of the state of Nevada, he has seen his franchise value just absolutely skyrocket from $2 billion to $6.2 billion. That's not too bad for a guy who inherited a team from Al Davis, his dad. So, when reporting the topic, it's really, I think, essential to point out that the teams are deriving literally all the revenue that come in, besides the ticket costs.
Plus,
So that
And-
does
and-
speak to
Plus-
the equity issue. Andy?
well, it's plus the players. Alan's right that the owners benefit enormously, and the figures for Mark Davis, Al Davis's son, going from 2 billion to 6.2, I think it's pretty accurate. But keep in mind that when you have a sports figure, baseball, football, but wherever the person is playing, and they play in a stadium that's more juiced up, right? It's got all the modern revenue generating accoutrements. It's got catering, it's got signage galore, it's got prop betting, and so on and so forth. When that athlete hits a home run in the new stadium, there are more people watching who are paying more money to go to the stadium than in the old stadium. And so the athletes, what we call in economics, marginal revenue product, when the athletes produce more value because they're in a better, richer stadium, better, richer venue, then their value to the owner goes up, and so their salaries go up. So this is two groups that are benefiting enormously, generally, from the construction boom. One is the owners for sure, and the other is the players who have seen their salaries skyrocket.
Right. And in baseball, where, there's a sense of free agency where you really can have some teams pay a lot more in payroll than others. That's exactly what Andy's talking about. In the other leagues where we have collective bargaining agreements, in the NFL, NHL, and NBA, as an approximation, 50 cents of every dollar of sports-related revenue goes into the players' pockets. So generating an extra $1 million of revenue is going to generate $500,000 of additional player income as well, and not necessarily for one individual player, but again, spread across the league. So again, if you ever talk to me as a reporter and you don't hear the phrase billionaire owners and millionaire players, I must have had an off day, because I must use that particular phrase 300 times a year.
So we're getting some great questions. Clark,
yeah.
do you want to?
Yeah, I want to jump in here and actually get to the questions a little earlier than I thought, because there's a lot of great questions coming in. I'm going to start with two from Philadelphia, which are along the same lines. One from Jeff Gamage of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and another one from Faye Anderson, Watchdog journalist with PHL Watchdog. Both going back to something you were just starting to talk about, Alan. So Jeff asks, can you say how journalists can address huge benefit claims by teams, like 9,000 jobs, 4,000 permanent jobs, $450 million in quote unquote economic impact? He says this is also vague. It's just like a claim that appears on the team website. How do journalists address this? And also Faye Anderson asks about the 76ers basketball team. Specifically, they claim that their new arena that they want will have an economic impact of $1 billion. They're not requesting city funding at this time, she says, but they're open to state and federal funds. That economic impact study is that they said that they would do is also delayed by 6 months. So she says, how do we counter a claim of economic impact if that is what the independent study finds? So all this gets back to something that you've done, Alan, which is these economic impact statements come out from the team. they're kind of there. Maybe journalists reprint them without thinking much about them. How have you dealt with them in the past?
Well, let's look at the jobs. Huge reason cited for these stadiums. The Raiders Stadium will literally have thousands of jobs. We have the chairman of the both the stadium board and our tourism board. The LVCVA is the same man, Steve Hill, by coincidence, and he will tout 7,000, 8,000 jobs at the Raiders Stadium. The important thing is to look at the type of job. These are temporary game day event jobs. And in fact, during the Super Bowl, I covered a story about the attempt by a local union to unionize the workers, because workers who were working the Raiders games and other events at the Raiders Stadium, Allegiant Stadium, were basically saying that they're making 15, 16 bucks an hour, and that the beers that they're serving are actually a lot more than their hourly wage. So number one, biggest suggestion, look at the type of jobs being produced.
I think as a journalist too, that's a really powerful thing, is like that idea of the cost of the beer is more than this person is making per hour. Alan, too, you said something in an interview that I saw with you. The Raiders CFO had claimed $2 billion in economic impact over some years, I guess. I'm not sure the time frame there. What did you do when you heard that? Can you just like, because I think that'd be really helpful to see like how you sort of like push back on that.
Well, to me, the big problem with these gigantic economic impact numbers is that the methodology is not explained. The criteria is not explained. And our news site has adopted a policy that we will not publish these numbers unless we sit down with the person and they just simply walk us through how they come up with these huge billion-dollar numbers. You know, most of the time they're taking the number of people who are attending an event, or here in Las Vegas who are traveling to the event, and they apply a per capita spending, and then they just multiply the number out, and voila, you know, $2 billion of spending.
Mhm.
It's a lot more complicated. Andy and Vic can like get much more into the weeds on the problems of. I personally, I go back with Vic when the Raiders were looking to build their stadium, and Vic taught me the whole concept of displacement. It's probably one of the most important concepts, is that a lot of these fans are simply replacing tourists who would be in the market and in those hotel rooms anyway.
You know, I would like to ask Andy and Vic, and also you, Alan, as a reporter, what are like 3 generic good questions that you should ask when presented with these kinds of estimates of the economic benefits? And you've already alluded to it, but maybe if we could just kind of capture those and have it as a takeaway for our audience.
Well, so here's one big one is if you're quoting an economic impact study, ask who commissioned the study, who did the study and who commissioned the study. If it is a study that is paid for by the league or the team, that is not an economic impact study. That is a press release, right? There are companies who are in the business of putting up economic impact statements in order to justify public subsidies and in order to justify public pieces there. So number one, ask who did the study or who paid for the study. Number two,
it's a great idea to say. It's a great idea to say, is this a study or a press release? Just a very simple question like that.
Do not quote from the press release is a good journalistic answer ever. And I'm here to tell you that quite a few economic impact studies are in fact glorified press releases. So number one, who paid for the study? Number two, can you see a copy of the study? You would be amazed by how many people say, there is a study that says it's $1 billion. but you can never get your hands on that study. It's the mysterious Canadian girlfriend, right? Scenario there. That one doesn't exist, and you'll never be able to find it because it doesn't exist. So there's number two, and number three. Call an economist. You can find lots of us. There's me, there's Andy, we can give you 5 or 10 others who are nationally known, and almost certainly whatever your local jurisdiction is, there's a sports economist there who teaches in your local state or your local region, who understands these issues, who's got a local feel. Most of us have a good national feel as well. But I'll hand it over to Andy for any other comments there too.
So I endorse everything that Victor just said, but look, here are some other questions you can ask. You can ask what assumptions are being made. What a lot of these studies do, and they vary quite a bit from study to study, but what a lot of them do is they say, we had 3 million people in attendance last year, and the average price per ticket was $100, and they multiply that out, and then they import a multiplier, an economic concept, and then they just multiply it out, and they never deal with the fact that most of the money that's spent at the sports facility is money that is part of people's leisure budgets. And they have a certain amount of money that they can spend on various kinds of leisure. And when they spend $200, $500 taking their family to the ballpark, that's $200 or $500 they don't have to spend at a local bowling alley, at a local theater, at a local restaurant. And so it's money that's being, as Alan was alluding to earlier, it's money that's just being displaced from spending in one part of the city to spending in another. And the net impact can be very close to zero. Another thing that one should ask is with regard to the multiplier. One of the things that appears to be true in virtually every case is that there are many, many more leakages when you spend $1 at a sports facility than if you spend it at a local restaurant or a local bowling alley. The reason for that is the owner, the proprietor of the local restaurant or bowling alley or theater tends to have a more moderate income and tends to live almost 100% of the year in that town. When you spend money at the restaurant, it tends to circulate and stay in the town more. When you spend money at a ballpark, it's going to millionaires and billionaires. They generally don't live in the town year round. They generally have much, much higher savings rates. So they take the money and they put it into the world's money markets. And the money doesn't stay in the town for these and other reasons. So the leakages are much, much greater. And therefore, the multiplier, the sports multiplier, is much lower than a typical entertainment multiplier for that city. So there are a lot of specific questions like that you can also ask about what validity the press release of the study, depending on what we call it, what validity it has.
I'm going to go to one more question. John Hanna with the AP in Kansas asks about with these economic impact studies, if they even are studies, they're very simple sounding from what you've all said. What are things that they leave out? Like, what should journalists be asking? Like, what are you leaving out of this analysis? What could be part of it that is not?
Okay, so at least one thing. So especially if we're talking about a city like Kansas City, right? They obviously, the voters just turned down a couple stadium deals there with a referendum last month. Most of these $1 billion sort of economic impact claims are predicated on the idea that if you don't pay for a new stadium, that the Chiefs and the Royals will disappear, right? That these teams will no longer be in being and go away. So one of the real questions to ask is, is it credible that a baseball team is moving on you? Sometimes it's more credible than others, but Nashville, different than Kansas City. Nashville is a place where they spent $1.3 billion on a new stadium, where there was exactly zero chance of the Titans moving away, right? So any economic impact claim there was almost completely absurd, because the Tennessee Titans were going to stay in one of America's hottest cities, regardless what's going to happen. Again, teams aren't going to, the Dallas Cowboys aren't moving out of the Metroplex, right? The Wizards and the Capitals are not moving out of the greater DC area. So one important thing is, what what are you assuming by having these big economic impact numbers? Are you assuming these teams are moving? And if so, exactly where are they moving and why? And are you going to be able to find another city instead willing to put down $1 billion of taxpayer money if the voters in Kansas City, for example, aren't willing to?
Yeah, a
Yeah.
huge question that needs to be asked is what businesses get hurt by major sports events? Here in Las Vegas, a lot of publicity about our Raiders Stadium, about the athletic stadium project, and also about the Golden Knights Arena. But we have a Formula One race. The Las Vegas Grand Prix is a 3.8 mile, if you want to kind of call it like a linear stadium, if you will. And they came up with these huge economic impact numbers. I won't repeat them. However, there were businesses along the route that were inaccessible because of the barriers and the fencing and the light mounts. A lot of businesses literally lost millions of dollars in revenues. Does that loss get factored into this economic impact number?
It's really interesting.
Typically, they don't. So it's really important to look at what are the businesses that are losing money when you have some of these events. F1 had a PR person last year literally tell Metro Las Vegas it's going to be hectic on the strip. If you're not related to the race event, don't even bother coming to the strip corridor. What about all the money lost from people not coming to the strip who typically would be going during that race weekend?
You know,
And
another
that's sort of analogous to Andy's point about people have a certain amount of money that is their discretionary income.
Exactly.
And then, they could spend it on restaurants, bowling alleys, whatever. So again, there's like for many people, a fixed budget.
So I wanted to add that it's important also to consider the political jurisdiction that's being considered. It's quite possible, and I was involved recently in discussion about the economic impact or the financial impact of the Atlanta Braves moving up to Cobb County, and I happen to believe that there was actually a positive fiscal impact on Cobb County. But there was certainly, insofar as that was true, it was hurting Fulton County, which is the county where Atlanta itself is, and it's probably hurting some surrounding counties as well. So if a team moves over a political jurisdiction, it's because those two jurisdictions in some way are competing with each other, and one jurisdiction's gain can be the other jurisdiction's loss. And so one of the things we have to recognize here is that sports teams in the United States, because of the structure of our sports leagues, have benefited from the fact that the demand for sports teams is much greater than the supply of sports teams, because they limit the supply of sports teams. And that forces cities into competition with each other, which gives the teams the leverage they need to extract the subsidies that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and to
There have
follow up
been-
with Andy
Sorry,
on
go
that,
ahead.
and so I disagree with him on the Fulton County and Braves issue, but his point is exactly right. Is that that there are definite neighborhood effects, right? And I don't think any economist would suggest that that building a stadium doesn't have significant neighborhood effects right around the stadium. Those effects tend to be pretty narrow, and they dissipate within half a mile or so based on all the economic impact or the economic impact studies. But again, that doesn't mean that the metro area wide benefits from this, right? So exactly what Andy said is that you can have an issue where the new Cobb County might benefit or not from a stadium, while Metro Atlanta has no effect, and certainly no effect on the state of Georgia. So you'd be insane to put state money into moving a stadium from one county to another, even though you might be able to make an economic argument about a specific neighborhood effect.
And that goes back to the issue of equity, I think, because if, as Victor's suggesting, it's a very narrow effect and not widespread, then it's accruing to only a few people. I'd like to, a number of questions have to do with non-major league sports teams, with colleges or minor league. And maybe some of our participants here are not in a city or an area where there is a major league team, but there could be minor league teams or important college sports teams. To what extent would the discussion today have been different if we had constrained it to minor league teams or college teams?
I'll take that one just to start with. One of the big things is what really allows the professional sports teams, like Andy said, to extract huge amounts of money of taxpayer money out of the taxpayer's pocket is the threat to relocate. So you say, hey, build me a new stadium in Buffalo, or the Buffalo Bills will become the San Antonio Bills, right? What the nice thing about colleges is we don't see these huge amounts of money being spent at least on new stadiums. Again, Michigan, Ohio State, they're playing in facilities that first started, almost 100 years ago. Harvard is playing in a 100-year-old stadium, right? And one of the reasons for that is my own institution, Holy Cross, can't say, hey, Worcester, build us a new college football stadium here, or we're moving Holy Cross to Florida. That's not going to happen, right? And you can see how big an impact that threat of relocation has by looking at how lavish professional sports facilities are, where there is that threat to relocate, compared to much more modest facilities at colleges and universities, where there literally is zero potential that Ohio State is going to become Tennessee State when they relocate the football team.
I want to follow up on this topic as well with a question from David Lieb at the AP, which is, in particular, do the MLB's minimum stadium standards, is that directly leading smaller cities with minor league teams to pump public funding into improving those ballparks? Is that something that we know about at all?
I think it is happening. There are enhanced stadium standards and enhanced locker room standards. It costs more money to build those and to maintain those. And minor league teams have also had a good deal of success in extracting public subsidies. It varies quite a bit from the size of the city and which league they're playing in and which major league team they're affiliated with. But minor league teams have been quite successul in extracting subsidies as well.
To that point about Andy and the subsidies for minor league stadiums here in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas ballpark, which is the home of the AAA Aviators, at the time it was the most costly stadium for minor league baseball to build at $150 million. $80 million came from the LVCVA, our public tourism agency, in the form of a naming rights deal. It's unheard of a AAA minor league team winning an $80 million naming rights deal. It was absolutely absurd. The outgoing chief of the LVCVA obviously had close contacts with the president of the team and was able to get the board to approve an $80 million naming rights deal to call a local minor league park Las Vegas ballpark. Keep in mind that the LVCVA's charge is to bring tourists and visitors to our market. Minor league baseball and here in Las Vegas primarily is for locals. So
Alan,
I'd like to see that one topped, $80 million for a AAA naming rights deal.
I want to follow up with you, Alan. You've had a headline on lvsportsbiz.com last year, which was Big Sports City, Small Town Politics, and it strikes me that is probably the case for a lot of cities and counties that are thinking about giving money towards these things. So what are some of the types of sources that you recommend journalists have in their back pockets? Like who are the types of people that you find yourself going to a lot?
Well, this sounds so obvious, but whatever documents they do provide, scrutinize them, take a close look, and also go to lawyers and go to people who have experience with evaluating all these documents and have them read by people who can pick out some of the code language and some of the jargonistic terms that are used in these agreements. I'm trying to, here's a great example. Here in Clark County for the Formula One race, the promoter, the organizer, submitted a traffic report after an absolute mess last year. Probably it was really received a lot of national and international attention. Try to ask for as many public documents as possible, and the documents that they do give you, take the time to actually scrutinize line by line. The details in them and the verbiage can be absolutely fascinating.
I want to do one more quick follow-up with you. This is from this is on this topic from Elaine McGregor, editor of Centertown Buzz in Ottawa. How can freedom of information requests be used to clarify the cost to the public? Is there, Alan, have you used public records requests? Is there like a freedom of info angle here?
I mean, there is FOIA. I mean,
Yeah.
I do routinely, I also, just yesterday, I submitted a formal records request for our LVCVA. So go to the agency, find out what the method is. Sometimes they'll have a form online that you do have to fill out. Take the time to be meticulous in filling out the form. It's very important that you're very specific with the information you're trying to request. So take the time to be precise in the language in terms of the type of information you're looking for.
How about in terms of jobs? I mean, we talked about that earlier, and there have been a number of questions about that. There's a sort of a secondary issue here. Stadiums are now being built along, in conjunction with lots of other facilities. So like in Foxborough, we have Patriot Place, which has restaurants, actually has medical offices, has retail stores. Does that change the calculus at all about the number of jobs as opposed to like every other Sunday for 14 weeks in the fall? And again, is this just an opportunity cost that those businesses, if they're viable, would be there anyway or be someplace close by anyway?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So the good answer there is independent economists, and those are, again, what I say here is independent, folks not being paid by the league or the teams to come up with numbers. Generally academics. We've been studying this concept of economic impact of sports, both stadiums, teams, big events, and we've been studying this for about 30 years now, roughly the same sort of time when we had this big stadium boom, right? Starting in the early 90s or late 1980s. And there's at least 150 peer-reviewed articles on this over the last 30 years. Those have been nicely summarized in a couple literature review articles there. And it is the almost uniform finding that sports has little to no economic impact on metro-wide economic areas. And that's in terms of income, it's in terms of employment, it's in terms of tourism, it's in terms of tax revenues. Again, little to no economic impact. And again, how do you say, well, no, I see these gigantic facilities coming up around baseball stadiums. Look at the Battery in Atlanta, like Andy's talking about. But the question is, countywide or metro area wide, does that move the needle at all? And the answer typically is no. So again, even if you find a significant local impact around a stadium, economists have been looking at this for decades, and even when you add these, again, kind of stadium villages, typically just redirects economic activity that would have been happening elsewhere in the city to these stadium areas. And when you look citywide, you don't see anything moving the needle at all.
So I think Victor and I mostly agree here, but not entirely. One of the things that's going on with these auxiliary developments, the mixed-use developments around the ballpark, is that because of the things we were talking about earlier, it's much more difficult to commit public funds. And so you want, at least on the surface, to present a financing plan that leans more heavily on the private sector. And so one of the ways the private sector, in this case, the team owner, can go along with a higher superficial level of commitment is if the city gives that team owner development rights around the area. And then they not only have development rights, but then it turns out they have tax abatements for 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road. And they also have infrastructural things that are being financed. So I think you have to be very careful about this, because it's a scheme really not to lower the public contribution, but to make it more politically palatable. Now, one of the areas where I think some of this discussion needs to be qualified is you have to look at, when you create these mixed use developments around the stadium, is where are these activities coming from? Is it a restaurant that relocates from block A to block B next to the stadium? Which is often the case. And to the extent that that's happening, there's no positive impact at all in the area. But if the new developments that are in the mixed use development area are coming from outside of the city, they're coming from outside of the county, coming from outside of the state, then it's possible that there could be some positive impact. I think that the reality here is, just like the rest of our lives and the rest of our society and the rest of our politics, reality is complex. And whereas it makes sense to generalize that these things, much more often than not, don't provide a positive economic impulse, the devil is often in the details, and you have to look at it.
I will offer one suggestion for kind of doing a little counter here. I'll offer a suggestion for the teams and the governments and the officials who are pro-subsidy, and that is to take the foot off the gas on all this economic impact stuff. Highly controversial. Some people might believe it. A lot of people are very skeptical. I would stress the more of the civic nature of the teams. I mean, when the Vegas Golden Knights won the Stanley Cup here last year, it brought together so many people who otherwise would never be together. I mean, it creates kind of a civic pride that it's hard to put a number on, and I get it. Stress like the civic and public nature and the benefit from that. But in terms of these economic numbers, trying to throw out all these big gargantuan numbers to justify public vote expenditures, take the foot off the gas on that.
This is something that economists have started to look at, if I'm not wrong, through surveys asking people, like, what is the value of having a team in your city? Is that correct?
It's evaluation methodology.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is a real thing, and I think most of the honest economists around will say, yeah, there are some definite positive, again, amenity value to stadiums, to franchises. The problem is when we actually try to measure these in a reasonable way, at least the problem for the teams is, people say, yes, we love the team, but we love them at a rate far less than the sort of subsidies that are being asked for. So, for example, just one example here of a very credible, very well-respected academic team looked at the value of the Jacksonville Jaguars to Jacksonville, Florida. And this was, again, about 20 years ago that they looked at this, and they found that the Jaguars had something around $25 million of amenity value to the citizens of Jacksonville. Now, mind you, that'd be a much higher number today because of inflation and economic development and things like this, but you probably wouldn't be greater than, 3 or 4 times as big. So, $100 million value, say if we give it 4 times as much, $100 million value to the people. Well, guess what? The Jacksonville City Council just approved about $800 million of subsidy for the Jacksonville Jaguars just this week. So again, yes, these amenity values are real and they exist. They also tend to be a fraction of the size of the stadium subsidies that we're seeing handed out to places, in places like Nashville, in places like Jacksonville, and in places like Buffalo.
And again, the opportunity cost issue is here. If you ask how much do you love the Celtics, I would say a lot. And they say, compared to what? So, compared to having better schools, compared to having nicer parks, compared to having better libraries in towns. So, question, I'm sure, these are smart people and they've done their homework and asked the questions properly, but it's important to take these things in a proper context, which again is sort of the issue of opportunity cost.
Michael, I have to share a little anecdote. Someone from the sports industry recently told me that Because, a lot of times, schools and education is stacked up versus the spending on sports here in Las Vegas. Someone told me directly, and you'll get a kick out of the Massachusetts guys. Someone said, if you like education, move to Massachusetts. So, that was the response here in Las Vegas.
I want to get to just one question here. I know they were short on time, but this is a really good question from Nina Thorson of KQED. Here in Oakland, we are confronting the opposite question of most markets, the economic impact of losing a sports franchise. How do you approach that story?
Hasn't Oakland fallen into the bay already from losing the? No, yeah, no. Look, I think it's basically the same analysis. Victor was mentioning all of the studies that have looked at this over the last 30 years. If bringing a team into the city does not lead to a positive economic result, then taking a team out of the city is not likely to result in a negative economic result. I think a lot of the way this evolves depends upon the details and other characteristics of the cities. But I don't think that Oakland should be particularly worried about the economic impact of losing some of its teams. And as Alan has pointed out, it's not entirely clear yet that they're going to be losing the Oakland A's. And I think, Alan, isn't it true that the Mayor Goodman in Las Vegas has told the A's to stay in Oakland?
That is true. She took a lot of grief for that. Las Vegas, I appreciate Clark making that reference to the headline of that story, because the culture of politics here in Las Vegas is that even though there's a lot of booming going on with sports, the culture of how things are done is very small townish here. And it's a very monolithic public opinion. Most of the public officials are afraid to speak out. And you're right, Andy. Carolyn got a lot of grief for actually coming out and saying what was on everyone's mind. And that was, maybe putting a baseball stadium on the Strip isn't the greatest location, and maybe the A's should just build their stadium on the waterfront back in Oakland. That's the thing which has been a little disappointing as a reporter. We kind of thrive on having as many different voices in our stories, but here in Las Vegas, even Clark County, the county commissioners, Clark County is the second most powerful government unit in the state of Nevada behind the governor. It's the county that runs the Strip. They failed at standing up for the locals and the people when it came to Formula One. I covered this topic in like 5 different markets around the country. I've never seen a local government not come and have the back of the local folks like here in Las Vegas. What's a little weird about Vegas is that we're an outlier. The Jeremy Agueros of the world here, who is a prominent, one of the quote unquote consultants that Victor was referring to, he's come up with these numbers about how half of our economy is hooked into tourism. So, it's kind of a tricky thing to say. People will acknowledge that, maybe sports stadiums don't make up all the money they do, but here in Las Vegas, people will argue that it's so important to the tourism that that's how it's justified. I don't think anyone is against the stadiums per se. It's the public money that's going into them that has riled up people.
Alan,
Now, let me 100% say that with Alan. No economists are really super pro or anti-stadium. Where we really get our hackles up, it's the public financing.
Right.
Can we just, we're really coming up on time here, but you had mentioned offline to us, you have like a list of like 3 or 4 things that you try to include in every story. Could you just share those? And especially, we were talking about the TV spots, which are often, very short, and you just don't have a lot of time to get into this issue. I think it'd be really helpful to have those things just for people to, at least maybe they could take those off.
Yeah, some of the points that I've made through today, in fact, is number one, talk about all the money that needs to be spent to pay off the bonds. Again, you'll hear $750 million for the Raiders Stadium. It's more than $1 billion. So mention more than $1 billion that's been contributed to help build the stadium. And number two, who benefits? It's really important to tell your readers that the beneficiary are the teams. and they're garnering the lion's share of all the revenues. And you can kind of go through them besides the tickets. You know, I mean, those are two things that I find are almost boilerplate necessities that just are not placed in a lot of stories I notice here in Las Vegas.
Mhm. Well, Michael, do you want to add anything else? I know we're up on time.
Well, we're out of time. I just want to express my
yeah.
appreciation
Yeah.
to our very fine panelists and also to all the participants. And I'll just do an ad for Econofact here. I put in the chat the location for Econofact. Econofact represents an effort to create a bridge between top academic economists and journalists, the general public, policymakers, by explaining policy relevant issues in a very accessible way. So we were very fortunate. For example, Andy has done a couple of memos for us in a podcast. I hope Victor will do that as well. And we have a very wide range of topics. So I invite you to log into the Economist website if you'd like, you can subscribe to our newsletter, or if you send me an email at michael.klein@tufts.edu, I'll put you on our journalist list.
And the journalist resource sort of does things in the other way. We're all journalists covering research for the purpose of connecting the news media and academic work. And we've had so many great questions. I'm so excited to see everyone. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to all of them. I would venture to say if you want to pose these questions directly to anyone on the panel, I think they would be happy to help you. Maybe give Victor a week or two. I know he has to grade some papers. But otherwise, thank you all so much, Andy, Alan, Michael, Victor. Great to see you all, and thank you everyone for being here. Oh, and the recording will be up on journalistresource.org in the next few days. So thank you everyone, and take care, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.